Good morning. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is actually it's a brand new talk, so I'm not entirely sure how long I'll take, so I'll kind of balance that on the way. But it's work that we're doing for a new book that we've signed. I work with two colleagues at the London School of Economics on cloud computing, and we've just signed a couple of months ago to write a book for Palgrave Business, which should be out in November. Most of it's already written, on managing the cloud corporation. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is, in a sense, the last chapter of that book. It's the forward-looking issues associated with the cloud and the issues associated with cloud and business. We are actually still seeking case studies, both for that book, but also for a piece of work that we're doing with the University of Missouri in St. Louis and MIT Sloan on cloud computing globally. This is work funded by Accenture. That's a research project looking at cloud. If anyone's interested in that, we're particularly looking for businesses and client pairs, so client-provider pairs looking at cloud computing. Get in touch with me. I can't stay for the whole day, but I'm going to get Florian. Florian here in the red shirt is my PhD student. He's around all day. You should talk to him anyway because he's ex-Google and very bright. But please do get in touch with us if this interests you. So what's my argument today? My argument is that cloud decisions are long-term strategic decisions and that we need to think of them strategically from an organizational perspective. That focusing purely on cost saving and cloud essentially misses the point. These are all important, and I'll talk a little bit about efficiency, but I think we need to focus a little bit more, not simply on the cost savings, but on the future opportunity of cloud. And therefore, I'm going to introduce the idea of the cloud corporation and what I mean by the cloud corporation as an integrated network of service. And essentially, I'll end the talk by presenting an example of the cloud corporation as I see it. So today, and most of the narrative that you will hear around cloud is obsessed with this idea of efficiency. And we're seeing cloud mostly pitched as an outsourcing decision, the decision to move cost outside of an organizational context. And there are real good reasons for that. There are efficiency gains associated with cloud. If people want to know more about that, I suggest you Google statistical multiplexing, the way that you can, through virtualization and through the sharing of virtualized resources in a cloud data center, improve the efficiency of that data center and therefore drive down costs. So there are real cost savings associated with cloud. But this narrative essentially focuses on risks and opportunities in equivalence to IT as we have understood it today. So the comparisons that are made in terms of cloud are with our current offering, our current data centers, our current applications, the way that we do IT today. And this is important. We should be focusing on that equivalence. And we did, this is a piece of research published called the Cloud Desires Framework, in which we discuss those equivalences. And we identified, and David, I thought, highlighted this very well, issues like latency, which aren't particularly well discussed, but actually if you look, and we were interviewing 50 organizations and doing literature searches, we discovered that latency is a big issue, often not discussed. Similarly, security. We need to take seriously the security. We need to take seriously the issues of contracting and the challenges of service level agreements. And we need to think about service level agreements, and particularly the fact that a cloud provider with a changing balance of usage patterns can't offer the same kind of service level agreement that a hosted service provider can, because they don't know that whether their server has 1,000 users or 1,000 people on it or one person on it at any moment in time. So expecting them to offer a fixed risk profile for that one server is difficult for them to manage. Their usage patterns expand and contract. So how can their risks expand and contract on that basis? These things need to be thought about. However, this is still comparing IT with the current IT offering. It's still an outsourcing model where we compare what we have with what we've got. And this leads us, I will argue, to a race to the bottom. This is the pitch that Nicholas Carr made in his 2008 book, The Big Switch, and also his Harvard Business Review article, IT Doesn't Matter. And these incredibly influential pieces of work are what led us to believe that, as he said, in the long run, the IT department is unlikely to survive, at least not in its familiar form. It will have little left to do once the bulk of business computing shifts out of the private data center and into the cloud. Business units and even industry employees will be able to control the processing of information directly without legions of technical specialists. Okay? If you've seen Nick Carr talk, he shows a picture of a water wheel, a ginormous water wheel, and says, look, factories used to have these things. They used to manage their own IT. We heard David mention earlier the idea that we are managing our power, that computing is just like the electricity, it's going to be plugged in. Okay. And this leads us to sound, as IT people, like turkeys voting for Christmas. We have a vested interest in keeping the status quo, and therefore we're seen as challenging in our desire to keep the equivalence, to keep the status quo. We need a new narrative. We need a new way of thinking about cloud that moves us beyond this equivalence if we are going to deal with that strategic agenda of the long-term challenge of cloud. Some of this is a little bit further than just the shipping out of tin from data centers today. However, there is an irony in here. Because the irony, as Steve Ballmer said when he talked recently at the LSE, is that most people, most CEOs around the world today, the largest expense on their budget, which they don't feel they have a visceral understanding of, is usually information technology. That actually this equivalence is compared to something we have a poor handle on in terms of cost and benefit. If you ask most CEOs what their IT actually costs on the ground, they are not convinced that they have the right figures. Okay, so the idea of IT in terms of cost equivalence is challenging there. But also I want to propose the idea of where does IT equivalence get us? Yeah? This $3,398 was clearly seen to be cheap by some marketing guy back in the 80s for 10 megabyte hard disk. Now, anyone today, if you told me today that for £4 I can buy about, 8 gigabytes of storage on a USB stick, and I went back there, their question wouldn't be, wow, that's phenomenally cheap. Their question would be, what on earth would I do with that much storage? Their question would be, what on earth would I want that much storage for? The issue would not be the cost. The issue would be the capability. 10 megabytes then was enough to power your business. So the question was, if you went back then and said IT is about the cost equivalence of the hard disk, they wouldn't imagine that these things would be in video recorders, that these things would completely change the way that music works, and would revolutionize the way that people deal with things at home like photographs. So we need to think a little bit further. And for me, this narrative is this thing. And I wrote a piece of work, and you just need to look at these bit.ly links at the bottom. I wrote a piece, and it was a kind of jovial piece I wrote for my blog, where I went back to the literature from the 1980s and said, what happened when PCs arrived? So look at the debate around software as a service today. Software as a service today is sold to the executive as being something they control. You know, Salesforce.com, if you read Mark Benioff's book, it is all about selling to the executive. It's about selling the executive a cheap version of what they already have, so it's cheaper, with more features and better capability. In 1980-81, this was sold in exactly the same way. The PC was sold as the executive can buy a PC, forget IT, you don't need them. You don't need them with their big, heavy mainframes. You don't need them with their big mini computers. You can go to Tandy and buy a PC with your credit card. The PC will offer you applications that are more user-friendly and better for your business than those big, heavyweight mainframe applications. And it's cheap. Let me just stress that again. The PC was cheap. And it severed the relationship between IT and the application. And it severed the strategic control over IT by the IT department. But what happened? By 1984, the literature's changed. In 1984, the literature in my field, in information systems, is discussing how do we wrestle control of the burgeoning cost of PCs on the desktop. The fact that large numbers of people have signed up for what seemed like standard type PCs. That we had CompanyNet, we had CPM, we had DOS, we had, I have the list on my paper. I'm too old. I was 5 at this time, so the idea of me remembering all these operating systems is long. But you know, VM, we had huge numbers of different operating systems on these machines. We had Lotus. Remember them? We had Digital Research. Remember them? You know, these companies, they were household names. They could never go bust. The idea that we signed up to a standard with the PC. And what happened by 1984, we saw that Microsoft and Novell stepped in to wrestle control of this burgeoning thing. So I'm being given the 5-minute mark, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. So how do we think about cloud? How are we really going to deal with this and this change and this strategic change? Well, for me, it's not focusing on the technology, it's focusing on service. It's focusing on what are the service that we want and what are we desiring from IT. And we, in this research paper, we describe it in terms of 3 things. We're desiring efficiency, we're desiring simplicity, and that's where most of the debate associated with cloud has focused on. But we're also desiring creativity. We're desiring the support of different speeds of innovation within any organization, whether it's public sector or private sector. And this is about, in some ways, it's about ambidexterity, which is that we wrestle inside our organization with different speeds of change. We have bits of the organization which are about alignment, leveraging and exploiting our capabilities, rolling out and continuing what we already do, and bits of our organization that are about nimbleness, adaptability, agility, and change. And that cloud computing needs to be thought of in supporting both of those. I'm going to focus, however, on the issue of innovation, and that's my main focus. And what I want to argue, and from a service perspective, what I want to argue is that this is not cloud computing, that this diagram is part of the problem for cloud computing. So this is the diagram that's standardly put around cloud. The cloud is seen to be the internet. But this is an architectural diagram, a kind of technology-focused diagram. And it implies with the organization, it implies that the organization is, as I used to live in Manchester, and when you drive out of Manchester through Oldham, on the right-hand side was the big Pifco factory. And you could see it. It had Pifco on the side, on the outside. It was ginormous 1800s mill, and it had a fence around it. And the implication of this is the organization is like that. When you drive past that Pifco factory, you know what's in the Pifco factory and what's out of it. The gates say when people walk through those gates, they're inside the organization. When they walk out of those gates, they're outside the organization. And the cloud model that this projects is like that. That all we're doing is shipping one part outside of the factory gates. We're taking one bit of IT and we're outsourcing it. Remember that standard outsourcing model. I argue that the cloud corporation, and what I mean by the cloud corporation is this. Cloud is fuzzying the boundary of the organization. David's talked about social media and social networking. They are fuzzying the edge of our organization, whether we like it or not. We can focus on cloud as an outsourcing model, but inside our organizations, people today, through shadow IT, are engaging with using Facebook and Dropbox and Gmail to support their work. This is not nefarious use of IT. This is them engaging with the cloud in the support of their actual work, whether we like it or not. We're also, through cloud, we can create strategic relationships with other organizations. And I'll give you 2 examples of what I call the cloud corporation. I'll have to skip that slide, other than to say if you want a history lesson on where I think some of this is going, read this book on the box, which was a history of the shipping container. Because if you think that cloud computing is about shipping boxes and outsourcing, I think the way that the shipping container and the standardization of the shipping container revolutionized the logistics industry gives us a lot of lessons to think about. So this is the model of the cloud corporation that we drew up for the reports we wrote for Accenture. And I'm not going to go through this slide, I'm just going to give you 2 example cases. One is Avon. Avon, the cosmetics company. So we talked to Salesforce about their work with Avon. Avon used to be about coming, knocking on doors, saying, would you like to buy cosmetics? That all went out the window. Avon today is about sitting in front of Facebook. The people who sell for Facebook, which are separate businesses, are single people who sit around working on Facebook. What's happened is that Salesforce have produced an application that sits inside Facebook and connects with the back-end services of Avon and allows them to sell through their Facebook connections into the channel. Now, Facebook has been integrated through Salesforce with Avon. Avon is now strategically aligned with the development of Facebook. Who would imagine that one social network would affect another? And for those who also think that this isn't for them, this is Suki. This is You may have heard of this. This is from the student protests in London in 2011. This is about the public sector and the police force. So the police force have invested a phenomenal amount of money in communication systems. And they, in the student riots, now this is all from media reports, so I haven't had a chance to do the research. One more minute, just one more minute, last slide. This is about the student protests, and what was written about in the newspaper articles was the fact that 3 or 4 students at UCL in London during the student protests hacked together with Twitter, Google Maps, and some other services, a service which produced a real-time map of the approaching of the police. So these green dots are the protesters, and the red dots are where the police are coming from. People on the ground in the protest had on their iPhone a real-time communication system which provided them a better picture of what was happening in the protest than the police had. Polly put the kettle on, Suki take it off again. The aim of Suki was to stop people being able to be kettled. Now, some of the police reports suggest that this had a tangible impact on the ability of them to riot. So the police who say we're not interested in cloud computing, it doesn't affect our business, by 3 students in a Wednesday afternoon, their communication system is challenged. So this for me is about the cloud corporation. This is about the way that things can change whether we like it or not. And I would just stress at the end of this talk, do not underestimate the ability of the IT industry to fundamentally change the way that things are done. Look at HMV, look at Kodak, look at the things that are happening in the book industry today. Thank you.